Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Miriam and today I'm going to be doing my January wrap up. So in January I managed to read 9 books, which isn't terrible for me, but it's definitely on the lower end of what I normally read. I was in a little bit of a reading slump and I also started second semester of nursing school, so things have been quite busy and reading has just kind of fallen on the back burner. But so far in February, I'm kind of getting back on the bandwagon. Even though I only read 9 books, that's still a great number and I'm pretty happy with what I read. It was a bit of a mixed month in terms of the books I enjoyed and didn't enjoy so much. So without further ado, I'm just gonna go ahead and get started with my DNF and then work my way from my least favorite book to my most favorite book. So the book that I DNF'd is Daughter of Kana by Angela Hunt. I'm actually pretty upset that I ended up not finishing this book. I read about 30% of the way into it and I just could not bond with the characters in any way, shape, or form. And I'm really upset because Angela Hunt is actually one of my favorite biblical fiction authors. And for some reason, I just couldn't get into the book. So this takes place during the time of Jesus's ministry, and he attends a wedding in Kana where he performs one of his first miracles, which is to turn water into wine. And so we have our protagonist, and her name is Tasman, and her brother are twins running the whole wedding basically. So her and her brother and father are hosting the wedding and she's in charge of like the food, the wine, everything. And so she meets Jesus, she meets his siblings, and the story kind of picks up after Jesus has done this miracle. Tasman as a character was just very whiny and obnoxious, and I just got really frustrated with her and didn't really have any interest in continuing to see her character arc. So unfortunately, this book was just not too enjoyable for me and I decided not to finish it. So my least favorite book of January that I did finish is One by One by Ruth Ware. So this is a pretty well-known thriller, and Ruth Ware is also a very well-known thriller author. And so I did have higher expectations going into it, but unfortunately it did not quite deliver the way I was hoping it would in terms of the mystery. And I did touch on that in my anti-TBR video, which I will link down below, so you can hear more thoughts of why I'm just not going to be continuing on with Ruth Ware as an author. So this book basically starts off when a London tech startup company goes on vacation in the Swiss Alps. Each of the characters are introduced and we kind of get to learn about them, their personality, and how this group dynamic works with all of the employees of this company. We're also introduced to 2 characters who run the chalet in the Swiss Alps that the characters go to, and their perspectives are also quite important in the story. Unfortunately, an avalanche hits and there are some missing characters, casualties, and so we kind of go from there and we start to learn more about the characters and possible motives for nefarious actions. So unfortunately, the mystery itself, to me at least, was very obvious, and I was able to guess who the killer is pretty early on in the book. Oddly enough, I was actually going to give this a 3-star rating, but I bumped it down to a 2. So while reading it, I was enjoying my time. There's just something about Ruth Ware's writing style that it's like addictive and I couldn't put it down. And also the characters are just so weird and despicable and not great people. And so it's kind of like when you drive by a car accident or like you witness a disaster and you can't stop watching. That's kind of how I felt reading this book. Like there was just such a chaotic energy between each of the characters and I couldn't stop watching. I couldn't stop reading and kind of like shaking my head and like, oh my gosh, you guys are insane. But yeah, it was addictive in that sense, but the mystery just let me down so much, and that's why I ended up giving it 2 stars. But I'm sorry if Ruth Ware is a favorite of yours, if you enjoy her books. I just don't think they're for me. I've also seen her compared a lot to Agatha Christie, who happens to be one of my favorite authors of all time. And I just personally don't really understand how they can be compared, just because I think it has more to do with the fact that Ruth Ware does write kind of like closed circle mysteries where it's like an isolated event occurring and then people start dying off, and at least that's the case with this book. I'm not quite sure about some of her other books, but I personally don't think anyone compares to Agatha Christie, so that's probably another reason why I'm just really let down with her books. Next up, we have Midnight in Everwood by M.A. Kusniar. I started this book around Christmas and it dragged on into January. I wasn't able to finish it before the new year. And this book is basically about a young woman named Marietta, and she is a ballerina. It takes place in the Edwardian period in England, and like a lot of books that take place during this setting, the central themes really have to do with women's rights and gender roles and the expectations put on women in society. And I'll get more into that a bit later, but basically Marietta is a ballerina, and because of these expectations on her, she's supposed to get married. Her father is against the idea of her continuing on with her ballet career, and so in preparation of her final ballet performance, she meets a man named Drosselmeyer who ends up being chosen to create her stage set. If you've read the original Nutcracker tale, then Drosselmeyer will be a very familiar name. And so Drosselmeyer ends up creating this stage set, which seems to be very odd. It's infused with magic somehow. And this isn't a spoiler, it says it on the back of the book, but basically Marietta ends up in a place called Everwood. So she's gone through some sort of portal within the stage set and ended up in Everwood. And then the story continues from there. So originally I was swept away, like completely swept away. The writing was beautiful. I really liked Marietta, and I really enjoyed the scenes where she was performing ballet. It was just beautiful to read. I found Drosselmeyer to be a very fascinating character. He seemed very, very nefarious, but subtly so. I also really loved the descriptions of Everwood. It was tangible. It's like I could smell the gingerbread houses. I could taste the buildings made out of candy. It was beautifully written. But unfortunately, as soon as Marietta entered Everwood, it's like her personality completely changed. I felt such a strong disconnect between the way that she was while with her family in her hometown versus when she arrived in Everwood. It's like she became more naive and just very easy to manipulate. And it was such a juxtaposition compared to the way that she stood up for herself towards her parents, especially her father. She gave off this strength of character, and as soon as she ended up in Everwood, there was just this shift, and it was very jarring. As I mentioned earlier, one of the important themes is women's rights, and I think it's a very important theme, and I personally really like it when it's included in books, especially historical fiction, because it's a lot more relevant to those time periods. The thing that I had an issue with is, rather than showing the reader what the issues were and how the characters dealt with them, in this book it very much felt like all the characters did was whine about the issues, like, oh, woe is me, I'm a woman, therefore this and this and this. And it was just very, very repetitive. And like, I understand that it's important to talk about, but I would much rather, and this is just a personal preference, but I prefer books where it's shown and it's not just put into words in every single chapter. I completely understand the importance of social commentary, and I was expecting it in this book, just not in the way that it was presented. Another thing that was quite disappointing was the love interest. The chemistry was almost not there at all, and it just felt like a convenient plot arc, to be completely honest. Looking at this book solely as a comfort read for the winter season around Christmas time, it definitely delivered in that aspect, but overall I was quite disappointed, and so I ended up giving it a 2.5 stars. This next book I also gave 2.5 stars to, and I don't really have much to say. I actually think it's very forgetful. And unfortunately, that would be Poirot Investigates by Agatha Christie. So this is a collection of short stories, and besides one or two that I really did enjoy, I think all of them were just very, very boring. I didn't get that sense of aha when, things were solved, the mysteries were solved, and I don't know, it just wasn't the same as her full-length novels. Unfortunately, this was a 2.5 star read for me. Next up, we have a book that I found very difficult to rate because on one hand, I could have given it a 5-star rating just because of how much I enjoyed my time while I was reading it. But on the other hand, there were quite a few moments where I was like, oh my gosh, this is so silly. It's not meant to be taken seriously. And so I'm sitting at a 3.25 star rating. I might bump it up, but as of now, I feel most comfortable with that rating. And I'm talking about Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. I do need to say that Stephanie Garber will always be an auto-buy author for me. I read the Caraval series for the first time, I think a couple years ago, and it was basically the first YA fantasy series that I've read, at least since I was in high school, and I loved those books. I love her writing style. I love the heavy descriptions. When I'm in the mood for flowery writing, Stephanie Garber is the lady. So in Once Upon a Broken Heart, we follow a girl named Evangeline Fox, and she's very much a naive believer in happily ever afters, in that like fairy tale true love, until something sad happens. The man she thinks is her Prince Charming ends up deciding to marry someone else. Evangeline believes that the only person who can help her change this man's mind is the Prince of Hearts, otherwise known as Jax. And so Jax decides that he will help her in exchange for 3 kisses of his choosing. So she has to kiss 3 people that Jax chooses. Unfortunately, things don't go as planned, and Evangeline ends up in a place called the Magnificent North for this festival. While there, she meets her main love interest, and things continue on from there. So it was really nice seeing Jax again. He was in the Caraval series, and he was both a favorite and a hated character because he was so sneaky and you didn't really understand his motives throughout the trilogy. He's just such a mysterious, odd character. Another thing I love about this book is the fact that it kind of reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, not in the story itself, but in the sense of things are so happy-go-lucky and whimsical and magical and cheery and odd at the same time, with some really dark characters. There's just such an interesting vibe from this book, and I loved it for that. One thing that really annoyed me though was Evangeline. She's so whiny and immature and naive. She's also like the queen of overthinking. It was constantly, if I do this, then this will happen. But if I do that, then this will happen. But if I do this, then that will happen. And it just didn't stop. Another thing that disappointed me and brought the rating down was the ending. From what I've heard, I was expecting it to be some like crazy reveal, but honestly, I kind of saw it coming. It wasn't anything too surprising. So yeah, I'm really struggling with my rating. I don't feel comfortable bringing it up, but I also think it's too low. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it really, but I love Stephanie Garber, and I will be reading the second book that will be coming out either this year or next year. I'm not sure actually, but I did really enjoy it while I was reading it. So this next book, I'm actually pretty sad. I thought it would be a 5-star read, and that's Emily of Deep Valley by Maud Hart Lovelace. I highly think this is a personal preference issue and not a problem with the book itself. I'm personally not the biggest fan of books that center around high school and things that go on in high school, probably because I hated high school and didn't have the best of times. So this book is about a young girl named Emily who is nearing her high school graduation. The book starts around the time of her graduation and continues after, when her friends are going to college, but she has to stay home with her elderly grandpa. And it's basically just about Emily's time meeting different people who were living in her hometown. And yeah, I will say her character development was really well done. There is a very, very wonderful atmosphere in this book, and Emily has such a kind spirit. It did take me about halfway through the book until I was fully invested in the story, but once her love interest really became a part of the plot and their relationship started to bloom, I really did start enjoying it then. I also love that this book was written so long ago, but Maud Hart Lovelace wrote about the Syrian refugees who were living in Emily's town in this book in such an amazing way. It's just not something I expected from a book that was written decades and decades ago. I will say though that I do wish the romance had more page time. I think that it could have been better developed. But as it stands, I gave this around a 3.75 out of 5. The next book I'm going to talk about is one that I gave 4 stars to, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Gosh, this book. I've got thoughts. So a lot of people have read the book, and I don't know how much I need to go into it, but we have a young huntress named Feyre. Her and her family are living in the woods in poverty, basically, and she ends up killing a fairy who she thought was an animal, and as a result is taken to the fairy realm. She ends up staying with a fairy named Tamlin and one of his friends. So I did start this book with really low expectations, and I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would, but I don't like how smut-centered her relationship is with her love interest in this book. Feyre was a great character to follow, but their romance was so physical and so centered on physical attraction. And I really hate that when there's nothing else really that creates a strong relationship. I need more from romantic couples than just a physical attraction. The writing was really nice. This is such a guilty pleasure type of book. I did find the story to be quite captivating, but I just don't want to have to read through all of these smutty scenes in the next books. I honestly feel okay having just read the first book, and I don't think I'm continuing with the next ones. So my second favorite book of the month is The Lost Queen by Signi Pike. So I gave this book 4 stars, but the more I think about it, I'm probably going to be bumping it up to a 4.5 stars. This was so good. If you love Juliet Marillier, if you love like medieval fantasy, historical fantasy, please pick this book up. So this book is set in the 6th century Scotland, and we're introduced to twins Llangoreth and Lilacin when they're about 10 years old at the start of the book. Their mom had just passed away, and they're just experiencing a lot of hurt and loneliness. So Llangoreth is the only daughter and Lilacin is the son. And they have a very special bond, both with each other and with their father. So at the beginning of the book, we really start to learn about the various battles that the people in this area who, even though it's old Scotland, they were called Britons. And so they're constantly at war with the Angles of the south. So as Llangoreth and Lilacin are growing up, they start to get more involved in the politics of the day. And Llangoreth ends up meeting a man named Emrys. He's also known as Pendragon. So if you're familiar with any Arthurian legends, that will sound familiar to you. And this book is heavily inspired by Arthurian legends, which I don't know too much about, but I do want to read the original. I think it's King Arthur and the 12 Knights or something like that. So Llangoreth gets involved with one of Pendragon's warriors, but unfortunately she is betrothed to a Christian king at the time, and that has some consequences as during this time, there was a lot of tension between this new religion of Christianity and the old pagan ways of the Britons. It's just a great time of upheaval. The Christian priests are coming in, there's a lot of colonization occurring, and it's a very difficult time for the people. So Llangoreth's life is completely changed. She's thrown into all these political schemes, and she becomes a very essential person in everything going on. So much happens in this book, I feel like I can't say any more without just continuing to give plot points away. It is a slower paced book, which I actually prefer for historical fiction, historical fantasy. I very much enjoy being on journeys with characters as they're dealing with various dangers in their world. One reason that I didn't give this a 5-star rating is just because of the cheating in the book, and it's just a personal thing. I don't like cheating. I don't like it being a central plot point, and unfortunately in this book it is. But other than that, this is an awesome historical fantasy. I highly recommend it for anyone who enjoys this genre and anything Scottish. It's a great book. All right, and last but not least, my favorite book of the month was Little Town on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. If you've seen my, I think, November and December wrap-ups, I talked about the previous books in the series. It's one of my favorite series of all time. It is such a comfort read, so nostalgic. And basically in Little Town on the Prairie, the Ingalls family are now settled into a town. They're not living out in the wilderness anymore. The girls are going to school and life is just going on. These books don't really have like an overarching plot. It's very much each chapter is like this happened and then this happened and then that happened. And I just find it so fun to follow these characters, to join them in their adventures, misadventures, whatever it may be. It's just so comforting. So that's it for my January wrap up. If you have read any of the books I talked about, please let me know in the comments and what your thoughts were. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you are so inclined. I hope to see you all in my next video, and I hope you have an amazing day, evening, night, whatever time of day it is. I hope you guys are all doing well, and thanks again for watching. Bye!